Ambassador David Mitchell's legs felt heavy as he walked into the massive crystal hall of the Galactic Council. The ceiling stretched so high above him that it disappeared into shadows, and the walls seemed to pulse with their own strange light. Around him, creatures from across the galaxy sat in judgment of humanity's future. His heart pounded, but David kept his face calm. Behind him stood Dr. Rachel Brooks, Earth's top expert on alien life forms, and Captain Tyler Walsh, who commanded the small fleet that had brought them here. They had traveled for months to reach this moment, carrying the hopes of 8 billion humans and another 2 billion living in colonies. Scattered across nearby star systems, the Vorthan Prime Minister rose from his seat. David had met him before, during the preliminary talks, but the alien still looked intimidating, standing nearly 9 feet tall, with blue-gray skin and 4 golden eyes arranged in a diamond pattern on his face. The Vorthan spoke in a voice that sounded like grinding metal. "The human application for membership in the Galactic Council has been reviewed," he announced. The chamber fell silent except for the quiet humming of translation devices. "After careful consideration of your species' history, behavior, and potential contributions, we have reached our decision." David felt sweat forming on his palms. Everything humanity had worked toward for the past 50 years came down to this moment, when Earth had first detected alien signals and learned they were part of a vast galactic community. The dream of joining that community had driven humanity to unprecedented cooperation. Wars had ended. Resources had been pooled. The best minds had worked together to prepare for this day. "The application is denied," the Vorthan declared. The words hit David like a physical blow. Around the chamber, other alien representatives began speaking, their voices overlapping in a chorus of criticism. "Your species shows excessive emotional attachment to those who serve no purpose," clicked the Kalari ambassador, her head tilting as she spoke. Her translator made her chittering sound almost musical, but the words were harsh. "You spend vast amounts of resources keeping the weak and sick alive, instead of allowing natural selection to strengthen your population." A Drakmiri representative, looking like a walking reptile with silver scales, added his voice to the criticism. "Humans waste time and energy on those who cannot contribute to society. Your elderly consume resources without producing anything. Your disabled receive care instead of being allowed to die naturally. This is not efficiency." Dr. Brooks stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "We call that compassion," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. "We care for our people because they matter to us." "Exactly the problem," hissed a snake-like Xanthari from across the room. "Emotion clouds judgment. Logic should guide all decisions. Your species is infected with sentiment." The Vorthan Prime Minister raised one of his 4 arms for silence. "The evidence is overwhelming. Humans demonstrate what you call empathy and kindness. But these are weaknesses that would contaminate our galactic community. You rescue populations from natural disasters, instead of allowing the weak to perish. You share medical knowledge freely, instead of using it as leverage. You negotiate instead of conquering." "You are too soft," the Kalari ambassador added, her mandibles clicking with what David had learned was their version of laughter. "In a galaxy where only the strong survive, your empathy is a disease. You would weaken our resolve and make us vulnerable to threats that require harsh solutions." Captain Walsh's hand moved instinctively toward where his sidearm would normally hang, but they had come unarmed as a gesture of peace. The military man's jaw tightened as he listened to humanity being dismissed as defective. The voting began. Species after species announced their position. Vorthan Empire votes to deny. Kalari Collective votes to deny. Drakmari Republic votes to deny. Not a single voice spoke in humanity's favor. But the humiliation wasn't over. The Vorthan Prime Minister had one more announcement. Due to humanity's fundamental incompatibility with galactic civilization, this council hereby bans all human vessels from protected space lanes. Human colonies will receive no protection from pirates or hostile forces. No trade agreements will be honored. No diplomatic contact will be maintained. David felt the blood drain from his face. They weren't just being rejected, humanity was being completely cut off from galactic society. The alien representatives began filing out of the chamber, their conversations already moving on to other business. To them, humanity had been judged and found wanting. Case closed. As the massive hall emptied, David turned to his small team. Dr. Brooks looked like she wanted to scream, her years of studying alien cultures and preparing for peaceful contact now seeming wasted. Captain Walsh stood perfectly still, but something dangerous had appeared in his eyes. "Sir," the captain said quietly, "they've made a serious mistake." David nodded slowly. The aliens thought they understood humans. They saw kindness and assumed weakness. They witnessed mercy and believed it meant inability to fight. They were about to learn how wrong they were. 3 months had passed since humanity's crushing rejection at the Galactic Council, and the alien blockade was tightening like a noose around human space. Massive alien warships patrolled the borders of human territory, turning away any vessel trying to reach Earth's colonies. Supply ships carrying food, medicine, and raw materials were forced back at gunpoint. The message was clear. Humanity would be starved into submission. The aliens expected panic. They thought humans would break apart, fighting each other for scarce resources. They believed desperate human leaders would come crawling back, begging to reconsider the Council's decision. After all, every other species had either joined the galactic community or been destroyed by it. There was no third option, but in the underground laboratories beneath Geneva, something entirely different was taking shape. Dr. Rachel Brooks had barely left her research facility in weeks, surviving on coffee and determination. The sterile, white walls around her were covered with holographic displays showing alien DNA structures, biological analyses, and medical records dating back decades. She wasn't alone. Scientists from around the world had joined her in what they privately called the Project. These weren't weapons researchers or military strategists. They were doctors, biologists, and humanitarian workers who had spent their careers trying to save alien lives. Now they were using that same knowledge for a very different purpose. "Look at this," Rachel said, pointing to a complex molecular structure floating in the air before her. Her colleague, Dr. Kevin Park from Seoul, leaned in to examine the data. "Remember the plague that hit the Vorthon mining colonies 5 years ago? We spent 2 years developing a cure, working around the clock to save their population." Kevin nodded. He had been part of that mission, watching human medical teams work tirelessly to understand Vorthon biology well enough to create effective treatments. "We learned everything about their immune system, every weakness, every strength, every vulnerability," Rachel added quietly. The implications hung in the air between them. The same knowledge that had saved millions of Vorthon lives could now be used to end them. Down the hall, Dr. Amy Chen was reviewing psychological profiles of alien species. Her specialty had been diplomatic relations and conflict resolution. For 20 years, she had studied how different alien minds worked, what motivated them, what frightened them, and what broke their will to fight. Every peace treaty she had helped negotiate had required deep understanding of alien psychology. "The Kaleri are fascinating," she told her assistant while reviewing old diplomatic files. "Their entire society is built on hierarchy and dominance. But there's a weakness there. They can't handle chaos or unpredictability. When their command structure breaks down, they become paralyzed." Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Colonel Tyler Walsh had been promoted to head the newly formed Strategic Command. The military facility in Colorado buzzed with activity as teams of analysts worked around the clock. But these weren't typical war planners. Half of Walsh's staff were former diplomats, scientists, and aid workers who had spent decades building relationships with alien species. The holographic displays in the command center didn't show typical military targets. Instead, they mapped psychological pressure points, biological vulnerabilities, and social weak spots that could bring down entire civilizations without firing a single shot. The beautiful thing about empathy, Walsh explained to his staff during their daily briefing, is that it requires you to truly understand others. You have to know exactly how they think, what they fear, and what would hurt them most. For 30 years, humans have been the galaxy's therapists, doctors, and peacekeepers. We know these species better than they know themselves. Captain Lisa Anderson, formerly a diplomatic escort, now headed the intelligence division. She had attended hundreds of alien cultural exchanges, religious ceremonies, and social gatherings. Every conversation, every observation, every moment of connection had built a detailed picture of how alien societies functioned. They mistake our kindness for ignorance, she said, reviewing files on Drakmary's social structure. But every time we helped them, we were also learning. Every medical mission taught us their biology. Every peace negotiation revealed their psychology. Every act of goodwill showed us their weaknesses. President Nathan Hayes called an emergency meeting with his top advisors. The weight of humanity's future pressed down on everyone in the room. For months, they had tried diplomatic solutions, reaching out through back channels, hoping to find some alien leader willing to reconsider. Every attempt had been rebuffed. The blockade is working, reported Secretary of Defense Janet Torres. Our outer colonies are running short on critical supplies. We have maybe 6 months before some of them become unsustainable. Dr. Rachel Brooks entered the room carrying a tablet loaded with her research. Her eyes were red from exhaustion, but her voice was steady. We have another option, Mr. President. Everything we've learned over decades of peaceful contact, we can weaponize it. The room fell silent. These were people who had devoted their lives to building bridges between species, to healing rather than harming. The idea of using their knowledge destructively went against everything they had stood for. They want to see what humans are like without our softness, the president said finally. Maybe it's time to show them. He signed the authorization with a hand that barely trembled. Around the room, former diplomats and scientists nodded grimly. The galaxy had taught them that mercy was weakness and kindness was a liability. Now, humanity would demonstrate that their empathy had never made them weak. It had made them perfectly informed about how to destroy everything the aliens held dear. The aliens had awakened something they didn't understand, a species that knew them intimately, cared for them deeply, and now had every reason to use that knowledge against them. The first sign that something had changed came on a quiet Tuesday morning on the Vorthon, agricultural world of Kepler-4, 42b. Farmers working in the vast grain fields noticed their crops beginning to wilt. But this wasn't ordinary plant disease. Within hours, the Vorthon workers themselves began showing symptoms, a fever that seemed to target their unique four-chambered hearts, causing their golden eyes to dim one by one. Dr. Rachel Brooks watched the reports from her laboratory beneath Geneva, her face expressionless as the death toll climbed. The pathogen spreading through Vorthon space wasn't random. It was a masterpiece of biological engineering, designed with intimate knowledge of Vorthon physiology that only someone who had spent years saving their lives could possess. It targets the protein sequences that make them different from other species, she explained to her colleague, Dr. Kevin Park, as they monitored the outbreak. 5 years ago, I worked day and night to understand those same sequences so I could cure the mining plague. Now I know exactly how to exploit them. The plague moved through Vorthon space like clockwork, hitting agricultural worlds first, then spreading to urban centers. But this wasn't the random destruction of a natural disaster. It was surgical, precise, designed to cripple their food production while leaving their infrastructure intact. Someone would need those facilities later. Halfway across the galaxy, Ambassador David Mitchell stood in what used to be a Kalari communications hub. The insectoid aliens who had once controlled this station lay motionless around the broadcasting equipment, their compound eyes reflecting the emergency lighting. David had traded his diplomatic robes for a military uniform, the silver insignia of Earth's new strategic command gleaming on his collar. He activated the communication array, knowing his signal would reach every corner of galactic space. As his image appeared on screens across 1,000 worlds, the camera caught glimpses of the Kalari bodies behind him, not destroyed by weapons, but felled by a toxin that Dr. Amy Chen had engineered to exploit their unique nervous system. "Greetings to the Galactic Council," David said, his voice carrying the same calm tone he had used in diplomatic negotiations for 20 years. "3 months ago, you told us that humans were too soft for your galaxy. You said our empathy was a disease that would weaken your resolve." He paused, letting his words sink in across countless alien worlds where emergency broadcasts were interrupting regular programming. "You wanted to see what we looked like without our humanity. This is us without our restraint. This is what you created when you confused our mercy for weakness." Colonel Tyler Walsh's fleets moved through space like shadows, appearing at strategic points throughout alien territory. But these weren't typical military campaigns with massive battles and heroic last stands. Instead, human ships struck with the precision of surgeons, targeting exactly the right pressure points to bring down entire civilizations. The Drakmari had laughed at human emotional bonds, calling them a sign of weakness. Now they watched helplessly as their rigid caste system collapsed under carefully orchestrated social pressures. Human agents, posing as traders and visitors, spread ideas and information that turned the warrior castes against their leaders. Within weeks, civil war erupted across Drakmari space as their society tore itself apart. Captain Lisa Anderson coordinated these operations from her command ship, using decades of diplomatic knowledge to predict exactly how each Drakmari clan would react to specific provocations. "They're so proud of their logical hierarchy," she observed, watching reports of battles between former allies. "But every hierarchy has weak points. You just have to know where to push." The Xanthari faced a different kind of destruction. These snake-like aliens prided themselves on pure logic and cold rationality, scorning human emotion as primitive thinking. Dr. Amy Chen had spent years studying their psychological profiles during peace negotiations, learning exactly how their minds worked. Now she used that knowledge against them. Human agents fed the Xanthari computer networks with logical puzzles that had no solutions, philosophical paradoxes that their rational minds couldn't resolve. The more they tried to think through these problems, the more paralyzed they became. Entire Xanthari colonies ground to a halt as their leaders became trapped in recursive thought loops, unable to make decisions. "Their logic is their strength and their weakness," Amy explained to her team as they watched Xanthari society collapse. "They can't handle true paradoxes. It breaks their minds." Back in her laboratory, Dr. Rachel Brooks stood surrounded by holographic displays showing biological data from dozens of alien species. Vials and samples from 30 years of humanitarian missions lined the walls. Every disease she had helped cure, every genetic disorder she had studied, every medical breakthrough that had saved alien lives. "I used to use this knowledge to heal," she said quietly to her reflection in a darkened computer screen. The woman looking back at her seemed older than she remembered, worn down by months of turning everything she had learned about preserving life into methods of ending it. But there was no regret in her eyes, only the cold satisfaction of a job done with professional precision. Each pathogen she released was tailored specifically to its target species, designed to exploit the exact biological vulnerabilities she had mapped during years of medical cooperation. The galaxy had wanted to see humans without their softness. They were learning that human empathy had never made them weak, It had made them perfectly informed about how to destroy everything their former patients held dear, across alien space. Civilizations that had stood for thousands of years crumbled, under attacks that struck at their most fundamental weaknesses. And at the center of it all, humanity moved with the quiet efficiency of doctors, who decided that some patients couldn't be saved. The aliens had taught them that mercy was a disease. Now, they were discovering what humanity looked like when that disease was cured. The great crystal chamber of the Galactic Council had never seen such chaos. Emergency alarms blared throughout the station as reports flooded in from across the galaxy. The massive holographic display that usually showed peaceful trade routes now painted a picture of complete devastation. Red warning symbols marked dead worlds, severed supply lines, and collapsed governments. Prime Minister Vextar of the Vorten Empire stumbled into the emergency session, his once-proud figure now bent with illness. 3 of his 4 golden eyes had gone dark, victims of the plague that was consuming his people. His breathing came in ragged gasps as he took his seat among the few remaining council members who were still alive to attend. The Kaleri representatives' chair sat empty. Ambassador Zax had died 3 days ago, when the toxin released on her homeworld finally reached the capital. The Drakmari delegation consisted of only one surviving member, General Scarman, whose warrior caste was too busy fighting civil wars to send reinforcements. How did this happen? Wheezed Prime Minister Vextar, his remaining eye fixed on the holographic display. Our intelligence said humans had no military capability. They were pacifists, healers, diplomats. Admiral Thekros, of the Centauri fleet, managed to speak, though his usually sharp logical mind seemed fractured. The paradox viruses. They're still spreading through our computer networks. Our greatest thinkers are trapped in logical loops. They cannot escape. How do you fight an enemy that uses your own rationality against you? The chamber's main screen flickered to life, showing the familiar face of President Nathan Hayes broadcasting from Earth. But the human leader looked different now, harder, colder, with eyes that held no trace of the empathy the aliens had once mocked. "Greetings to what remains of the Galactic Council," President Hayes said, his voice echoing through the nearly empty chamber. "I understand you've called an emergency session. How thoughtful of you to include us in your discussions, considering you banned all diplomatic contact just 6 months ago." Prime Minister Vextar leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. We underestimated your species. We were wrong about your capabilities." President Hayes shook his head slowly. "No, you understood us perfectly. We are exactly as soft as you said. We do care too much about the weak and dying. We do waste resources on those who cannot contribute. You got everything right about human nature." The alien survivors exchanged confused glances. If the humans agreed with their assessment, why was their galaxy burning? "The problem," Hayes continued, "was thinking that our softness made us safe to hurt. You assumed that because we were kind, we were helpless. You forgot that kindness requires perfect understanding of those you care for." Across the galaxy, Colonel Tyler Walsh's fleets continued their methodical work. But these weren't conquering armies in the traditional sense. Human ships didn't land troops or plant flags. Instead, they arrived at each world with complete knowledge of that species' biology, psychology, and social structure. On Drakmiri worlds, human agents didn't fight the warrior castes directly. They simply introduced the right rumors at the right time, turning proud military commanders against each other. Within days, ancient alliances crumbled as clans that had fought together for centuries began destroying each other over manufactured slights and false accusations. Dr. Rachel Brooks monitored these operations from her command center, watching as each carefully planned intervention achieved its goal. "Every humanitarian mission we ever conducted was a learning experience," she explained to a room full of former diplomats and aid workers. "Every time we helped them, we gathered intelligence. Every medical breakthrough taught us their vulnerabilities. The Xanthari worlds presented a different challenge. Their pure logic made them resistant to emotional manipulation, so Dr. Amy Chen had developed something more insidious. Human computer specialists had spent months crafting philosophical paradoxes, specifically designed to exploit how Xanthari minds processed information. Give a Xanthari an unsolvable logical problem, and they can't simply ignore it, Amy observed as reports came in of entire Xanthari cities grinding to a halt. Their rational minds keep trying to find solutions that don't exist. They literally think themselves into paralysis. Back in the council chamber, Ambassador David Mitchell walked through doors that had once been barred to him. He wore the same diplomatic uniform he had worn 6 months earlier. But now, the aliens who had once dismissed him scrambled to avoid his gaze. The chamber that had once held representatives from dozens of species now contained only a handful of survivors. Most of the seats stood empty, their former occupants either dead or too busy dealing with the collapse of their civilizations to attend meetings. "You taught us that mercy is weakness," David said, his voice carrying easily through the sparse gathering. "You showed us that in your galaxy, only the strong survive. We learned your lesson very well." General Scarman of the Drakmiri tried to maintain his warrior's pride. "You fight without honor. These are not battles, they are assassinations on a galactic scale." David nodded thoughtfully. "You're absolutely right. We don't fight fair. We don't give you honorable deaths in glorious combat. Instead, we use everything we learned during 30 years of trying to help you. Every disease we cured taught us how to create new ones. Every peace treaty showed us your breaking points. Every act of kindness was, as you correctly observed, detailed reconnaissance." The truth settled over the remaining aliens like a cold blanket. Humanity's greatest strength hadn't been their military or their technology. It had been their genuine desire to understand and help other species. That same empathy that the aliens had scorned had given humans unprecedented knowledge of their targets. "The galaxy is ours now," David concluded, "not because we conquered you, but because you taught us that compassion was foolishness. You wanted us to abandon our humanity. Congratulations, you succeeded. This is what we look like without our restraint." Outside the council station, human fleets waited in perfect formation. They weren't there to occupy or govern. They were simply there to ensure that the lesson was complete. The galaxy had demanded strength over mercy. Now, they had it. 6 months had passed since that terrible day when humanity stood rejected before the Galactic Council. Now, the same crystal chamber hosted a very different gathering. The towering seats that had once held proud representatives from dozens of species sat mostly empty. Only a handful of alien survivors remained, their eyes downcast and their voices silent. The surrender had come 3 days ago, not through formal documents or ceremonial proceedings, but through desperate transmissions from the few remaining alien leaders, begging for mercy. The Vorthan Empire, once spanning 40 star systems, now controlled barely 3 worlds. The mighty Kalari collective had been reduced to scattered refugee camps. The logical Xanthari had simply stopped, their entire civilization paralyzed by philosophical paradoxes they couldn't solve. President Nathan Hayes walked to the speaker's platform, where the Vorthan Prime Minister had once delivered humanity's rejection. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Behind him stood the architects of what historians would later call the Quiet War, Dr. Rachel Brooks, whose biological weapons had been more devastating than nuclear bombs, and Colonel Tyler Walsh, whose fleets had dismantled galactic civilization with surgical precision. 6 months ago, I watched from Earth as you delivered your verdict on humanity. President Hayes began, his voice carrying easily through the sparse chamber. You told us we were too soft for your galaxy. You said our empathy was a disease that would weaken galactic resolve. Prime Minister Vextar, now the sole remaining leader of his species, sat hunched in his chair. 3 of his 4 golden eyes had been dimmed by the plague that Dr. Brooks had engineered from her memories of saving Vorthan lives. He tried to speak, but only managed a weak wheeze. "We offered you our best qualities," the president continued, gesturing toward the nearly empty chamber. "Our compassion, our willingness to sacrifice for others, our refusal to abandon the weak and dying. We showed you how we cared for our elderly, how we protected our disabled, how we rebuilt worlds devastated by natural disasters." Dr. Rachel Brooks stepped forward, her white lab coat replaced by a military uniform bearing the insignia of humanity's new Biological Defense Division. The woman who had once spent sleepless nights developing cures for alien diseases now oversaw programs designed to end them. "You called these qualities diseases," she said, her voice steady as she addressed the survivors. "You laughed at our medical missions. You mocked our humanitarian efforts. You told us that helping the weak was wasteful and illogical." The few remaining aliens shifted uncomfortably in their seats. General Scarman of the Drakmari, whose warrior culture had been torn apart by civil wars orchestrated by human agents, stared at the floor. The Zenthari representative, one of the few whose mind hadn't been broken by logic paradoxes, sat perfectly still. "Now you'll learn to appreciate those qualities properly," President Hayes announced. "The galaxy will be rebuilt, but this time, according to human values. You'll discover what we tried to tell you 6 months ago, that our softness was the only thing protecting you from our precision." Ambassador David G. Michal, still wearing his diplomatic uniform but now bearing the authority of Earth's colonial administration, addressed the practical matters. "Every surviving world will be placed under human protection. Medical teams are already being dispatched to treat the plagues and toxins that have ravaged your populations." The aliens looked up, with a mixture of hope and terror. The same species that had nearly exterminated them was now offering to save them. "You'll find our protection quite comprehensive," David continued. "Human administrators will oversee the rebuilding of your societies. Human teachers will educate your children. Human doctors will care for your sick and elderly whether you want them to or not." Dr. Amy Chen, formerly a diplomatic psychologist and now head of the Cultural Integration Department, stepped forward to explain the new reality. "We've learned that different species respond to different approaches. The Drakmiri will be guided toward more cooperative social structures. The Zenthari will receive philosophical frameworks that don't lead to mental paralysis. The Vort will discover the benefits of caring for their weak rather than discarding them." Colonel Walsh's voice carried the weight of absolute authority as he outlined the enforcement mechanisms. "Human fleets will maintain order throughout the galaxy. Every world will be monitored, every species guided with the same careful attention. We once used to dismantle your civilizations. We know exactly how each of your cultures works. We proved that over the past 6 months." The chamber fell silent except for the quiet humming of life support systems. The aliens understood the message perfectly. They had wanted to see humanity without its restraint, and they had gotten their wish. Now they would live with the consequences. President Hayes delivered his final words to the shattered remnants of galactic civilization. "Welcome to the new galaxy. We'll teach you how to be soft, how to show mercy, how to care for those who cannot care for themselves. You'll learn these lessons whether you want to or not." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Consider yourselves fortunate. You wanted us to abandon our humanity, and we did, for 6 months. This is your last chance to benefit from our compassion before we decide you're beyond redemption." The universe had demanded to see humanity without its weakness. It had learned, too late, that human kindness had never been weakness at all. It had been mercy, the only thing standing between alien civilizations and the perfect, devastating knowledge that came from truly understanding those you once tried to help. Now that mercy was being offered again, but this time on humanity's terms. The galaxy would learn to be gentle, to be kind, to protect the weak. They would learn, or they would join the countless others who hadn't survived humanity's education and the consequences of cruelty. The age of human softness had returned, but now it came with teeth.